Johnny Arcane by Jim Nail, read by Jim Nail. Chapter 12. Welcome Traveler, Part 1. Alone again, out on the open road with its freedom and adventure. But this time, his heart did not lift. The lonesome tug of what lay behind did not give way to the welcoming pull of what lay ahead. Mostly, he felt a kind of dread, for he knew now the real task was beginning. He recalled his winter at King Corn. It quelled his fear. All its wintry events drifted before him, but especially the faces, the smile lines and the care lines, the ripples of response as he watched each person struggle or surrender to the challenges of everyday life. For it hadn't been an easy winter in King Corn. Burlyman, Bearclaw, Ant, Jocko, Frankie Fulcrum, Maggie Mender, Misha and Marta, the cowboys, Birdleg and Climber, each brought a different pile of barn nails to the game. There had been conflict, and even injury, and even death, if a cow's death could be counted. Something of all these people flowed through his blood along a course that had once only belonged to Lucy. It was an energy. It moved in waves. He could feel it working its way down his legs and up again, passing through his sex and rising along the roadbed of his spine, warming his heart, flooding his head with color. And when at last it reached his arms, it burst out through his fingers and into the strings of his mandolin. Yes, he told himself, that's what it was like. But now, I must focus on the path before me. It's not a well-trodden path, and all afternoon walking he saw no one. The woods were mostly summerleaf, maples, and birches, just putting out of firs of green. Drifts of muddy snow lay about in the shadowy places. Occasionally, he had to ford a stream bed of snow melt, crossing the path. In one place, a makeshift footbridge had given in to the elements. The water swirling around the broken boards reminded him of the dolmen at Planktown. Crossing the river only, the chunks of chiseled debris and the snake-filled vault from which Jocko had produced the book. How old is this bridge, he wondered. Just a few seasons. That fallen structure stared at him with so many ponderous questions, as if a legion of very old ghosts were standing on the levee, asking him, who were we, and when did we live? Past the fallen bridge he approached an arrowed plank of wood nailed to a tree, carved with one word: Stonehouse. After that, the terrain opened up to a low scrub and clumps of oaks, and on the slope above a line of ancient stumps as far as he could see. This went on monotonously for a long time until the sun began to dip below the western ridge and Johnny's thought turned to shelter. Ahead, shadowed in twilight, stood a grove of trees, the flanks of which he had never seen before. Evergreens, yes, but they were not proud trees like the pines and the cedars. Their branches were gnarled, like an old farmer's hands, and there was no symmetry in their silhouettes. They seemed to be leaning over and curling around each other as if huddled together in fear. Vines connected them like a common shawl. Rather than trunks, they stood on multiple roots, fingered helter-skelter into the earth with dark, cavernous places in between. Something glinted deep within the grove, a flash of light, and it was gone. Johnny drew nearer. In the fading light, he made out the shadowed shapes of large boulders, stacked and mortared together to form a sort of dome, and like an outdoor kiln, but big enough for several people to fit inside. The entrance was framed with wood, but there was no door, and there were no windows. Focused as he was on this rough-hewn phantom, at first he failed to notice the sign on the post directly in front of him. Stone house. With caution he approached. He was weary, and most times any shelter would serve him, but there was something foreboding about this one. Above the door frame, 2 words were smudged into the bare stone. Welcome, traveler. This calmed him a little. He stepped inside. It smelled bad. An old smell, not the smell of something that was still there. More like something that had passed through many times, over many seasons. There was some light in the center of the room. A smoke hole on the roof admitted a dusty ray of sun. And directly below it, a fire circle of mounded ash. Wild animals had made nests in the corners, but they were long gone. Johnny kicked through the clumps of straw and uncovered piles of clean, dry bones. I'll sleep here tonight, he said, despite his foreboding, and he went outside to gather kindling for a fire. Over the fire, he roasted the turkey Maggie had spared down from the Springfest, and he brewed himself a cup of spike weed picked from the forests outside of Kinghorn. He spread his bedroll against the far wall and pulled a tattered quilt over his shoulders. The moment his head touched the floor, cats began to howl outside. You could tell by their voices it was the spring mating. He had witnessed this ritual many times as a child. Often he wondered how this act that heralded the spring and filled the world with new life could be conducted with such vehemence and rancor. Cats were despicable creatures. That's what everyone said. But sometimes as a child, he would encounter one in the hayloft or the woodshed, and there would be an exchange of essences. A cat would look in his eyes, and something would pass between them. I know you. We share something. We know that beneath all this softness and comfort, there runs an undercurrent of struggle, of restlessness, the potential for sorrow. This restlessness daunted his efforts to sleep. Every time the dreamy mists of drowsiness closed in and he felt himself slipping under, the cats would resume their angst. And he would have to start the process all over. Finally, though, the night settled in earnest and he descended into a warm, dark place where he was caressed by loving fingers. A sudden, brilliant flash of light woke him. He sat bolt upright in the dense darkness, slowly dispersed by a pale swath of moon flowing in through the smoke hole. He recalled the flash of light that had drawn him from the path to the stone house in the first place. He saw something he hadn't noticed before. A tiny red dot was glowing on the opposite wall like a crimson star. He stood and moved toward it, taking care not to trip on the firestones. A small natural enclosure in the rocks held a low table, and on that table, an open book, scored with ledgers and hand scrawls, the kind of book he had first seen in the dolmen chambers of Planktown. And on the wall, above the book, a circle about the size of a dinner plate, lit by the red dot. He touched it. It was paper, and a thin metal arm reached halfway across it. The arm was a pen, leaving a line of ink in concentric rings. He raised the book to the glow of the red dot so he could read the words. Each column started with a drawing of a phase of the moon, followed by a number. At the topmost column was a full moon circle, and the number 777. One line over was a single word: Stubblefield. A wave of uneasiness ran down his arm and forced him to set the book back on the table. Stubblefield. The 777th full moon. Could it be? He brought the book back to the light and followed the entries down the page. A waning crescent, 777. The dolmen's half moon, 777. Sputum, waxing crescent, 777. Arden's plain, full moon, 778. Fairheart. Yes, it was. But to be sure, he turned to the last page and read the entries. 4 full moon cycles, 16 entries. 854 to 870. King Corn. The shock was visceral. His head throbbed with it, and before he closed his eyelid, vein lines pulsed in the dark like bolts of lightning. Before his closed eyelids, vein lines pulsed in the dark like bolts of lightning. It couldn't be denied. For 5 summers and 6 winters, beginning with a feast at Stubblefield and ending with the winter at King Corn, someone or some group of people had been tracking his every move as he cut his convoluted path as a messenger across the map of the known world. But how? He remembered the message he had carried from Burlyman to Mayor Casterby. I believe Borderbinder has returned. He is the one who brings this message. His name is Arcane. He remembered the pictures that had flickered in Burlyman's eyes 5 summers later as he read Darcy Dinkum's message brought back from Hermit Town. Outside, a sound. Not cats this time. People, definitely people, human voices, stamping of feet. He leapt across the room, grabbed his bedroll, rolled himself into it, and curled against the wall. Immediately he sensed a figure in the doorway, and a smell, the latent smell in the room, but present now, emanating. Some grunting and some rustling, and then the tension eased. There was a voice outside. "Someone's in there, sleeping." "Well, shuck my horn, pig," snarled another voice. "We pitch camp in the woods then. Stand watch until he leaves." More grunting and some swearing, words like cat's paw and pig's fat. Johnny heard the voices fade as they rounded the impenetrable backside of the stone house. He heard a metallic sound like chains clanking and someone pounding stakes with a mallet. Then it was quiet. Of course he couldn't sleep. And there was a good deal of night ahead of him. He reasoned his course. Surely if they meant to hurt him, they would just come in and hurt him. He was merely an obstacle in their intentions. They would stand watch until he left, and then they would come in and do whatever they meant to do. Or would they? What if the stone house was some kind of sanctuary in which harm was not allowed? And once outside, he was fair game. An even more penetrating thought, what if they knew who he was? For it was becoming more and more clear. He was not an ordinary person. He was Johnny Arcane. No! His whole body recoiled at the thought. He was no one. He was no more than a rabbit, or a crow, or a single mummer dancing in the old stories to keep the borders intact. He was a person, alive for a while, and then gone. There was no hidden life. There were no side worlds. He could not be something other than what he was, Johnny Arcane, mother's son, messenger, climber of the silo, sojourner. He wanted to cry, but he dared not make a sound. He closed his eyes, and they filled with tears. It was more than he could bear, the weight of this crossing from the known world into the unknown. The shadows drew a cloak around him. He felt his bones soften and his blood go thin. He let the tears wash over him, and in the dark and watery expanse, a vision of someone came swimming toward him. Lucy. She was naked as she had been in the waters of the bathhouse the day they met. She touched him and spoke to him. "Johnny, Johnny, don't worry." She began to remove his clothing. "I will wash you clean."
Johnny Arcane passed along.